The hammer came down without warning. A blunt crack, sharp enough to split the dawn air of the hangar. Metal met bone, a sound too heavy to mistake for accident. Lieutenant Mara Voss staggered half a step, the world tilting, ears ringing like a detonated flare. The floor was cold and slick beneath her palms, oil and blood mixing into a dark mirror. Somewhere in the static of her vision, boots shuffled back. The men who struck her frozen in disbelief. She was supposed to fall, but she didn't. She pushed up, slow, deliberate, eyes locking on the one still holding the hammer. No words, just the silence of someone whose body refused to surrender. The light flickered across her face, a thin red line along her temple, sweat tracing through it like water over steel. The room seemed to hold its breath, unsure if it was witnessing a failure of physics or a birth of something else entirely. Now, before we show you exactly what went down in that debrief room months later, hit that like button and tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. Because after this mission, nobody in her unit ever dared to underestimate her again. That's the moment strength stops being theory. The moment you see what can't be broken, even when everything tries. And if you've ever felt that, if you've ever stood when you weren't supposed to, you already know what's coming next. Stay here. Watch what steel does when it's struck. The first thing she noticed was the smell of metal. It wasn't the blood. It was the rust on the pipes, the oil in the air, the cold tang that reminded her of every night she'd patched herself up in the field. Mara pressed the corner of the gauze to her scalp and felt the sting bloom sharp and clean. She didn't flinch. The mirror above the utility sink caught the faint tremor in her fingers, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the tape, the angle, the pressure. Control wasn't a word. It was a muscle she'd trained for years. Outside the locker room, boots echoed against concrete, voices low and sharp. A laugh, a whisper. Then the door slammed, leaving her alone with the hiss of the overhead vents. She rinsed the blood from her hands, watching the water swirl red, then clear. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice reminded her that she should report it. Protocol demanded it. But the instinct that had kept her alive through blackouts and ambushes whispered something different. Not yet. This wasn't an accident. It was a message, a test wrapped in cowardice. She'd seen the signs for weeks, the sidelong glances, the delays in her orders, the smirks when she spoke in briefings. Men who mistook silence for weakness always did. And so she said nothing, not to them, not to anyone. She taped the last edge of gauze, adjusted her collar, and stepped back into the corridor. Her footsteps echoed steady, even, deliberate, like the countdown before a reckoning only she could hear. Rumors don't need volume to do damage. They just need repetition. It started small, missed radio calls, misfiled reports, the kind of clerical errors no one noticed until Rhodes mentioned them twice in front of the right people. He didn't accuse, he suggested. She's been off since the accident, he'd say, shaking his head with quiet concern. Head injuries linger. Each word found a home in someone's doubt. Soon, every hesitation in her voice, every second she paused before answering an order, became proof of something that wasn't there. Mara watched it happen the way a sniper studies wind, patiently, precisely, from a distance. She didn't challenge him. She logged it. Who spoke to whom, when the room went quiet, which conversations ended the moment she entered. At first, she thought the command officers would see through it. But they didn't. They preferred order, even a false one, to confrontation. So they looked at her with that measured sympathy soldiers reserve for those they think are breaking. Isolation became procedural. She found herself reassigned to logistics briefings instead of operations, her access codes temporarily under review. The men who once trained beside her avoided eye contact. Roads filled the silence she left behind. Every day became a study in observation, patterns of behavior, rotations of power, the small betrayals that reveal where loyalty actually lives. Mara said nothing. She didn't need to, because beneath the calm, the calculation had already begun. And if Rhodes thought she was slipping, he'd soon learn what it looks like when someone starts to see everything. The gym was empty at night, the kind of silence that hums just above hearing. The air smelled of iron and dust, the ghosts of effort still hanging between the racks. Mara wrapped her hands with slow precision, the tape pulling tight against skin already rubbed raw. The bandage beneath her hairline itched, but she ignored it. Sweat stung the cut. She welcomed it. Pain was feedback. It meant the system was still online. She moved through the motions like a machine rediscovering rhythm, deadlifts, presses, controlled breaths that came out as measured bursts of steam in the cold air. Each repetition stripped away the noise of the day until only movement remained. The clang of plates against steel echoed off the walls, steady, relentless. Her pulse began to sync with the rhythm, metal and flesh, steel and bone, indistinguishable in purpose. She stared at her reflection between sets, the dim red light slicing across her face. For a long time, she didn't think anything at all. Then a single thought cut through, quiet but final. Steel breaks only when it's cold. So I'll stay burning. The words weren't defiance. They were instruction. A new operating principle. By the time she stopped, her body trembled with exhaustion, but her mind had crystallized into focus. She knew now what needed to happen. Not a strike. Not revenge. Just precision. The kind of precision that turns heat into form, chaos into direction. When she left the gym, the floor was slick with sweat and resolve. The mission brief was sterile, covert extraction, simulated hostels, derelict shipyard at 0200. Nothing unusual on paper, but every name on the roster carried tension like a hidden wire. Voss read it once, twice, noting how Rhodes had positioned himself as comms lead. Convenient. The one place where distortion could masquerade as error. She signed off without hesitation. Let him think she was walking blind. By the time they reached the docks, the fog hung low and heavy, muffling sound into something dreamlike. Rusted cranes leaned over the water like sleeping giants. Every footstep on the catwalks echoed too loud. Every radio click carried a trace of delay. Bravo unit, proceed to Sector 4, Rhodes' voice said through static. But Voss had already mapped the grid. Sector 4 was wrong, off by nearly 100 meters. A trap of confusion, not ambush. She didn't correct him. She simply switched frequencies, low-tech, analog, hand signals, light pulses, pattern codes older than most in her unit remembered. Her team followed instinctively. The air filled with silent motion, shadows cutting through fog, each one moving to the rhythm she set. Within minutes, they breached the lower deck, neutralized the targets, and secured the hostage with surgical precision. The whole thing took less time than the briefing. Rhodes' voice came back, irritated, feigned confusion. You broke protocol, Lieutenant. She keyed her mic, tone even. No, I corrected it. The words hung there, calm and final. When they exfiltrated, Command was already calling it a textbook recovery. Only Rhodes knew how far off course he'd tried to send her, and how effortlessly she'd turned the sabotage into success. Yet she filed no report, no accusation, just the same, measured silence. The kind that doesn't hide weakness, it hides timing. The debrief room was colder than the shipyard. Metal walls, fluorescent lights, everything too clean for what had just happened. Voss sat straight-backed at the table, uniform pressed, hands folded. Across from her, Rhodes leaned in like a man confident in his version of events. He spoke with the steady rhythm of practiced control. Lieutenant Voss deviated from assigned parameters. He began, voice smooth, almost sympathetic. Her behavior suggests ongoing instability since the previous incident. The words were bait, measured, rehearsed, meant to provoke. She didn't interrupt, didn't even blink. When he finished, she slid a small drive across the table. Footage from Unit Cam 2, she said. Her voice carried no charge, no tremor. The operations officer plugged it in, the screen flickering to life with grainy footage. Rhodes' voice giving wrong coordinates, his timestamp mismatched to command feed. Every line of data aligned against him with surgical precision. The room fell silent except for the hum of the projector. Rhodes shifted in his chair, the confidence draining from his posture. One of the senior officers leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Sergeant Rhodes, explain this discrepancy. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The silence grew heavier with each second he failed to fill it. Voss didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the small flag patch sewn onto her sleeve, the fabric slightly frayed, the colors dulled by sand and time. That was where her loyalty lived, not in the faces now squirming under fluorescent light. When the session ended, no one congratulated her. No one needed to. The truth had landed exactly where it belonged, clean, documented, irrefutable. And for the first time, She allowed herself a breath that wasn't made of restraint. The corridors felt different after the debrief, quieter, like sound itself was keeping its distance. Rhodes disappeared within 48 hours. No formal announcement, no paperwork visible on public channels, just a change in duty rosters and an empty bunk. The others understood what that meant. Some averted their eyes when Voss passed by. Others met her gaze only long enough to register something they couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or fear that she'd seen through them too. She never addressed it. Her days remained exactly the same. Dawn runs before reveille, maintenance checks before coffee, silent drills when the rest of the base was still half asleep. Her focus had no edges now. It wasn't vengeance that drove her, it was calibration, the act of aligning herself with the same precision she demanded from the weapon system she commanded. Every motion deliberate, every breath accounted for. Once, a younger recruit worked up the courage to ask her about the rumors. About Rhodes, the hearing, the hammer. Voss paused, not from discomfort, but from consideration. Then she said quietly, "Steel doesn't remember the hammer. It remembers the forge." The words hung between them, almost gentle, and yet they carried the weight of every blow that had tried to shape her. That sentence traveled farther than she did. It became a whisper through the ranks, part warning, part reverence. And though she never sought respect, she earned something rarer, silence in her presence, not from fear, but from recognition. The interview took place in a small, unmarked office near the docks, a room that smelled faintly of salt and oil, like the sea had found its way through the vents. The journalist set up a single camera, no lights, no production team, just her and Voss. He'd heard fragments of her story whispered through the ranks, each version more myth than fact. But when she sat down across from him, posture perfect, expression unreadable, he realized she wasn't there to confirm or correct. He asked careful questions about leadership, about pain, about what it takes to come back from betrayal inside a system built on trust. She didn't mention names, didn't describe the incident. She spoke instead about metallurgy, how steel isn't born strong. It's burned, folded, struck, cooled, and struck again. How every impact gives it structure. You don't fear the fire, she said softly. You learn its temperature. The camera caught her reflection in the window, the faint movement of the ocean outside framing her words like punctuation marks. Later, during editing, the journalist layered her voice over footage of training runs, ocean spray hitting the hull of a ship, the glint of sunlight on wet gunmetal. No captions, no commentary, just her voice, calm and even, echoing between images that felt older than any uniform. When the piece circulated quietly through military networks, it wasn't classified as testimony or report. It was labeled simply, Field Interview, Subject V. But for those who watched it, it became something closer to scripture. The hangar hadn't changed. The same scent of metal and oil lingered in the air, the same hum of distant generators pulsing through the walls. Dust drifted in thin shafts of morning light. Voss walked slowly across the floor, boots echoing against the concrete. Her steps paused at a small dent, faint but still there, the place where steel once met bone. She knelt, ran her fingers across it, feeling the cold surface beneath her palm. Time had dulled its edges, but the mark remained, quiet and honest. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply stood and unhooked the small insignia tag from her uniform, a piece of metal that had traveled with her through every deployment, every decision, every silence. She placed it neatly on the bench where she had once taped her wound, aligning it square to the edge. Not as surrender, but acknowledgement. Completion. Outside, the hangar doors groaned open, lights spilling in with the slow inevitability of dawn. It washed over the floor, over the scar in the concrete, over the tag that gleamed faintly in the glow. She didn't look back as she stepped into it. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving only light and the quiet hum of machinery still turning. Proof that nothing had broken, only changed form. They tried to break her skull. They forgot. The body bends, but the code doesn't. You can scar the surface, dull the shine, even twist the frame, but true steel remembers only the fire that made it. Lieutenant Mara Voss never asked for redemption because she never lost herself. She simply endured, refined, and returned sharper than before. That's the paradox of strength. It doesn't come from surviving the blow. but from understanding why it fell and standing anyway. So when you hear the story, when you feel that quiet anger, that flicker of recognition, ask yourself one question. When the hammer falls, are you the steel or the hand holding it? Because one of them breaks, and the other becomes something unbreakable. The forge doesn't care about excuses. Only temperature, only endurance. And the ones who learn that don't need to be remembered. They remember themselves.